Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Apologies for the delay. We had a few technical issues. Welcome to our 2021 Industrial Insights webinar. This is to celebrate the launch of our 2021 Industrial White Paper, produced by our market-leading Industrial and Logistics Services team, headed by John Campbell. It is timely, given that Vietnam has started to reopen post-lockdown, and many expatriates working in the manufacturing sector have returned to Vietnam to ramp up production to meet growing order books. At the same time, we're pleased to say that investor interest has picked up where it left off pre-lockdown. We have three exceptional speakers for you today, with a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Please post your questions in the Zoom chat box. To kick things off, we'll have Michael Kokalari, Vina Capital's chief economist. Mike provides thought leadership and technical acumen on a wide range of global and local macroeconomic issues. Mike is a leading spokesperson on the growth of Vietnam's economy over the past 10 years and on Vietnam's prospects post-pandemic. Next, we'll have John Talbot. John is the CEO and founder of LCA, one of Southeast Asia's most respected supply chain and logistics consulting companies that is affiliated with Savills. John is a supply chain innovator with 25 years experience in Asia, and he prides himself on delivering hundreds of millions of dollars in savings, as well as incalculable growth to clients. LCA offers supply chain consulting, supply chain software, transformation management, amongst many other services. Lastly, we'll have our own John Campbell, who heads Savills Industrial and Logistics Services team in Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City. John has over 5 years experience in Vietnam's industrial sector and is the go-to voice on everything to do with industrial and logistics real estate in Vietnam, for manufacturers, investors, e-commerce providers, data centers, and cold storage. Thank you for joining us. I hope you'll enjoy the webinar, and I'll now hand over to Michael Kokalari. Thank you very much.
Basically, FDI inflows, together with the emerging middle class, are really the two most important growth drivers for Vietnam. So we really have to watch this a lot. I mean, in my firm as being private equity investors. And then on top of that, we also invest in both real estate and industrial parks, et cetera. And not to put in a plug for Savills, but we found really fabulous information all the time from Savills. So that we're really happy to participate in today's seminar. Okay, the key message for you today is that the FDI story in Vietnam has not changed at all, despite everything that happened, over the last year with the COVID and Delta and all that kind of stuff. What you can see on the screen here is that all of the growth drivers that have been always been pushing the FDI story for all those years are still intact. Most of the things you can see on this screen are just, things that you probably self-explanatory. The geographic location, Vietnam is right in the middle of China and that the supply chains, et cetera. That having been said, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on some of these. And then, of course, if there's any questions about what I've said, you can, in the Q&A, you can ask about that. So let me get a little bit more into the details on some of the points that I've put up on the slide here. Really, the most important thing is that factory wages in Vietnam are 2/3 below those in China. And the quality of the education in Vietnam, the quality of the workforce in Vietnam is basically comparable to what you would find in China, for example. And that's according to surveys from Jetro and others. This slide that I have on the screen, I have not actually updated it in a bit. First of all, because we've been very preoccupied with everything happening in COVID, those last 2 years, of course. And by the way, the other reason I haven't updated it is because the story has not changed at all in Vietnam. The wage story is still there, the quality of the workforce, et cetera. Okay. The other thing that's really important to know is that the attractiveness of China as a production destination has really cratering now. And you've read all the stories about the regulatory clampdown in China, the power outages, all this kind of stuff. You've probably seen in the newspaper in the last couple of days that the Chinese have supposedly built some kind of mock-up of US ships or some kind of crazy story like that. So you will see more and more hesitancy for companies to set up new factories in China. We'll see the extent to which companies move their production from China to Vietnam, but I think, and places like Vietnam, I should say, but I think we could be pretty assured that going forward, new production facilities are really going to be set up in Vietnam instead of in a place like China. There was some surveys by UBS and others that something like 20% of the factories in China are likely to leave in the next 10 years. We won't be able to absorb all of that in Vietnam, but we'll certainly get a good chunk of that. And so there's some headlines here on the screen. You can see recent headlines. I mean, literally in the last couple of weeks on this topic. I'm going to dig a little bit more into this whole topic about the relocation from China to Vietnam. And that, of course, very closely related topic to that is the US-China trade war. Now, you may know that earlier this year, the US Treasury and the State Bank of Vietnam reached an agreement in which basically they agreed that on the Vietnamese side, they agreed that we're going to let the value of the Vietnam dong appreciate. And in exchange for that, basically no tariffs on exports from Vietnam to the US. If you look at all the metrics of Vietnam's trade surplus with the US and other things that the US Treasury looks at, I mean, we really check every box for being considered a currency manipulator. I'm not saying we are, but we certainly check all the boxes. And so if the US government wanted to impose tariffs on Vietnam, they would certainly be, within the justification to do that. And the reason why they're not going to do that, you can see on the right hand of this screen it's right hand of the slide that I have up on the screen. This is something not a lot of people know about, but anyone that has any interest in Vietnam should really look into this topic a little bit more. This is a paper by the Atlantic Council, which is a very influential think tank in Washington, D.C. that was published just before the Biden inauguration at the beginning of this year. And basically, they're laying out a strategy which says, hey, the US should really try to make friends with countries like Vietnam and Southeast Asia. We should really try to, promote the economic benefit and development. And that's why you see that even though Vietnam has one of the biggest trade surpluses with the US, they're not going to impose tariffs or do anything like that. So this is a very important point. And what they're doing is they're really opening the door and they're telling multinationals around the world, you're safe to set up your factory in Vietnam. We're not going to get hit with tariffs. So the government is really encouraging that. So you always want to do things when you have the government especially you may know that the US is Vietnam's biggest export market. So you want your biggest customer to say, hey, I'm happy to buy more and more stuff from you. Another dynamic, which I'll talk about just very briefly, and you can ask me more about this in the Q&A if you want, is that, long story short, both Korea and Japan face a situation which is called secular stagnation. And I have a lot of complicated details about this on the screen here, but the key is that both of those countries it's not like they would like to, they must move more and more of their production outside of their countries. And so Vietnam is kind of the most obvious place for them to move the production to. And that's because of the secular stagnation in both countries. And I could get into it more in the detail in the Q&A if people are interested. Another really important topic related to all this is that you're just starting to see now multinational firms helping to build out local supply chains in Vietnam. Multinationals, and this is the same thing that they did in Thailand and Mexico in the 1980s, Singapore in the 1990s, Singapore in the 1980s. So multinational firms, right now, Vietnam imports a lot of the parts and components. We use the cheap labor here to assemble them and then, send them off to the final sellers. But what you're starting to see is a build out of local industry to supply those FDI companies. The first big example of this is Apple Computer, which they've gone to an extraordinary effort to help some local firms that are suppliers. And then I have a slide here, which when you see this slide, your initial reaction, well, let me just show it to you. So the first batch of these AirPod headphones that are getting made by local suppliers in Vietnam, it appears that the quality was not so great, which can happen, you know, when you're in the teething stage. Now, when you see that headline, you might think, oh, well, that doesn't sound like very good news, but it actually is good news because I've circled something from the article here where you see that basically Apple really engaged with those local Vietnamese suppliers to help them improve their quality right away. So it shows that they're really focused on getting more of their production here and getting more of the products built by local suppliers. Okay, as I come to the end, towards the end of my comments, I want to address directly all these negative headlines that we saw especially during the Delta variant outbreak, when a lot of factories were closed and there was a lot of concern about this. If you look into the details of all these articles that were in the international press about, you know, factories in Vietnam are shut and maybe the factories are going to move back to China or, you know, go to another country or something like that. If you look into the details of these articles, I promise you, you will not find one company mentioned that is saying, hey, we're going to move our electronics production from Vietnam to Pakistan or Bangladesh. It's not going to happen. So this topic, in fact, what is happening is that, and we have really in real time, still these high-tech companies are, you know, and this is literally headlines from like within the last couple weeks. So the high-tech manufacturers are still moving more and more production here. And this is a version of, there was a famous economist, Joseph Schumpeter, and Schumpeter had this idea called creative destruction, which basically means that, you know, for an economy to sort of move up over time, you sort of lose the lower value added things over time, and then you go to the higher and higher value added things. And this is what's happening with Vietnam's FDI. If you look at all the registrations right now, it's all driven by high-tech electronics, you know, things of this nature. The very last comment I want to make, again, related to the COVID topic, is that it has happened over and over in economic history. I mean, throughout time, but also in recent years, as you can see on the slide here, that when countries face a really severe crisis, they can use that crisis as an opportunity to make structural reforms, make improvements that actually make the growth of the country stronger going forward. And the example I like the most on this slide I've highlighted is Japan in 1973, when they faced this terrible oil shock. Japanese industry at that time, the Japanese growth miracle was in full bloom. The Japanese economy was going in a particular direction. Boom, they had this terrible crisis. They shifted directions and they made a bunch of changes that then laid the foundation for strong growth for the next 20 years. One of the reasons that I'm very confident that this is going to happen in Vietnam is just purely coincidentally, where we, Vienna Capital, myself in particular, one of the people that the government and the Prime Minister has solicited ideas about, you know, what are things that we should do to change to encourage more FDI going forward. It's actually something I happen to be working on right now at the moment. So for that reason, and also looking back at this history of how crisis has played out in other countries in the past, I think the overall economic story here is much, much brighter than most people realize. And that's everything that I wanted to say today. And I guess we'll get back to the Q&A at the end. So, okay, thank you for your time and thank you for watching my my presentation.
Thank you very much, Michael. We'll now move on to John Tolbert. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Lot to cover in a very little time. So I wanted to give a personal perspective on warehousing in Southeast Asia. So from 25 years experience here, 22 of it consulting, really just what we think is going to happen over the next decade or so. So a quick one on who are we. As I said, we've been consulting for, based in Malaysia, but operating right across Southeast Asia and beyond for the last 22 years. We essentially focus on domestic supply chains. So it's network configuration, transport, inventory, warehousing, information systems that hold it all together. And interestingly, warehousing was very much the Cinderella of our business for the first 15 years, getting all of the feedback. But At the moment, I think we've got 4 projects running: Korea, Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, and all of them have a warehousing component. And I just noted we've had 3 warehousing inquiries in the last 24 hours. So warehousing is absolutely #1 on the consultant's plate at the moment. In terms of who we work for, mostly big manufacturers, big distributors, 3PLs, retailers, e-commerce, etc. So what I want to talk about is what's changing in Southeast Asia's distribution landscape, the likely impact on warehousing, and then how warehousing designs will evolve as a result. Sorry, and I don't know if the right-hand side of the screen is knocked off, but I'll explain what's there if people can't see it. So essentially, this is the standard distribution network. FMCG companies virtually all use this network. Automotive uses things very similar. Some pharma. It's the most common network. So most of warehousing, domestic warehousing, fits into this category. So typically, you've got a manufacturer. Sorry, I'll just turn on the pointer. You've got a manufacturer or importer, a central warehouse. In Vietnam, of course, it could be 2 or 3 central warehouses who deliver both to the modern trade and to distributors, and then from distributors onto retailers, who are on the right of the screen, and then on to consumers. Now, these networks have been in place since colonial times, often with exactly the same players involved, but they really, really are breaking down these days. I mean, if you start with distributors, they're usually overstocked because manufacturers have a strong tendency to push too much stock into them because that's when they make their sale. As a result, tensions build between the distributors and the manufacturers. The poor old salesman, when he's out selling to a retailer, even though he's overstocked, he's probably in somewhere like Indonesia only at 65 to 70% product availability. So he's got a third of his products are unavailable for sale. That does nothing for his relationship with the retailer he's trying to sell into. It often means, for example, that he should be selling chocolate flavored product into the retailer, but he hasn't got any, so he sells strawberry product. So he's not happy, the retailer's not happy, the consumers aren't getting what they want on the shelf because they've cleared the shelves of chocolate product. But the dangerous thing here is after he's made that sale, the information that goes back to the manufacturer's head office is we're selling strawberry. So the cycle starts again, and they start planning for more strawberry to come through the process and go into the manufacturing when actually it's chocolate they needed. So it's no wonder that these networks end up with such poor product availability. And they're expensive networks to run. There's a lot of players involved. Distributors holding stock is a very expensive thing. They have to borrow money from local banks. So they're expensive networks that just aren't delivering. And yet the manufacturers, who really have probably the most control over the network compared to any other stakeholder, they've been unable to make a change in them over the last 40, 50 years. And there's an inertia that's really damaging, and really it's threatening the whole existence of these networks. And we think they're going to fundamentally change over the next 10 years. Incidentally, in Indonesia, for one of the very biggest manufacturers there, I was told by one of their board members last week that they've lost 3 major distributors this year. And each of those distributors were pre-colonial distributors. They've been with them, I think independence was 1947. So these distributors have been with them since 1947, and this year they've walked away. And you never used to see a distributor walking away from a major manufacturer like that. So that it's hidden, but there's a major sort of problem in the distribution networks in Southeast Asia at the moment. And it's exacerbated, if you like, by first, if you see the orange boxes, the modern trade coming in for the last 25 years, even more so when the convenience store model started getting common. That's like a poison pill for local retailers. Just a convenience store opens up, you'll get 4 or 5 local retailers closed down around it. So that's damaging to distributors and the network. And then probably most of all, the digital disruptors, the e-commerce players and the people like Gojek and Grab, they've all looked at this sector and they can see the inefficiency, and for them it's just an opportunity. It's a challenging opportunity, but they're all looking at what they can do in this sector, basically to disrupt it completely. And I mean, the whole purpose of a distribution network is essentially, from a manufacturer's perspective, is to get the product close to the consumers. This is a demographic map of Central Java in Indonesia. And these distributors belong to one of the very biggest manufacturers in Indonesia. They've got, I think, 360 distributors in their network. But what you can see here is, even for the big manufacturers with lots of distributors, they're not really getting close to the population, all the population centers. You know, if you look at the population here or over here, there's a huge amount of population that's not in close proximity to a distributor. And you can be pretty certain that if you're not in proximity to the distributor, he's not delivering to you. The product may still reach you, but it will go through a sub-wholesaler. And so the manufacturer's lost control, lost visibility of it. So even when you've got intense networks, they're not really giving people the proximity they need. So these networks were never great. They worked because of the growth that was coming through in the last 30 plus years, but really they're beginning to fail now. In terms of what does this mean, I mean, or where we think things will go, the top half here is the current distribution network. So you manufacture or you import product, it goes into your central DC. And again, as I mentioned, somewhere like Vietnam, you could well have 3 central DCs if you like. And those DCs will perhaps once a week deliver into each distributor. You know, they try to fill truckloads, get them into the distributor, and that's the model. Where we think things will go and where we believe they should go is, again, a central DC, but then regional hubs across a country. Now so you may hold, a manufacturer might hold 20, 25 days inventory at the central DC, and maybe 4 or 5 days inventory at each hub. So they're really light warehouses that get replenished based on what they sell. But the real change here, and it might be hidden behind the text, behind the boxes for some of you, is that these distributors, the green circles, now go stockless. So instead of them holding a month's stock or 3-week stock, we actually take them to 0 stock and hold the stock instead in these hubs and at the central warehouse. Now, what that means is typically that takes about 40 to 45% of the inventory out of the network, and it brings inventory massively more under control. But it also means that availability, because if you're holding stock in a central warehouse and hubs with warehouse management systems and the like, you've probably got 98% availability. And that means when the distributor, when his salesman's out on a Monday taking orders, he has no visibility of stock behind him. So he will, if the shelf hasn't got chocolate on it, he'll order chocolate, and that'll be available the next day. So he'll make the sale on Monday. Overnight, the hub will pick the product, ship it to the distributor. So by 6 o'clock in the morning, it'll be available for the distributor to send out in his vehicles. And we'll even break it down by individual vehicles to make that transfer very, very fast. It's an absolute logical model, difficult to implement because it's a big change and a lot of joined up thinking needed. So that's one of the reasons there's been resistance to it. But we think that these networks are getting to the point where they have no choice. You know, the manufacturers are going to lose control over a sector, the general trade or traditional trade sector, where control is essential for them. And it's essential not just to survive in this sector, it's important because it protects them against being squeezed by the modern trade and by the digital guys. So that's the way we see, in one form or another, we think this is the future model. Now, what are these warehouses? So we're predicting there'll be central warehouses as there are today, but probably updated, and then regional warehouses. And of course, these regional warehouses, all these warehouses can be multi-user, so they don't have to be dedicated to one manufacturer. They could be shared across multiple manufacturers. And again, I'm not sure, the best part of this slide is on the right-hand side, so I'm not sure if I'm able to move this. But I'll talk over it anyway. So this was a project we did in Malaysia for a very big FMCG company last year. We compared a conventional building, they needed new warehousing. We compared a conventional one to a semi-automated building. Now, I don't know, I hope you can see the pie charts on the right, but if you can't, essentially about 65% of the operating cost of a conventional building is made up of land, construction cost, and then the equipment, the fit out, the racking, the equipment, with 35% being labor. In the semi-automated new build, land, construction, and equipment drastically reduced, but you do spend some money on automation. But the impact is a 30% reduction in total operating cost. So that's, I mean, that's astounding. It's not, and this isn't using high tech, this is using automation that's been around for 40, 50 years. ASRS, so automated storage and retrieval system, AGVs to move pallets around, nothing sophisticated at all, but it has a massive cost saving impact. And of course the soft benefits, headcount reduction, which certainly in places like Malaysia is critical. There's a warehouse operator sort of crisis, permanent crisis going on here. These sites are more flexible. They're certainly more scalable. They're easier to expand. You have to set less land aside for expansion than you would with a conventional warehouse. And they're relatively green. You know, they're smaller. They run big chunks of the warehouse run in darkness. So they tick all the boxes basically. And as I said, the key is about, this is a conventional warehouse, ambient, so normal temperature product. If you go to a cold storage environment, the benefits are even greater in terms of operating cost reduction. Just a 30% operating cost reduction, even up to about 35%, even approaching 40% if you're talking cold storage. We don't think anyone's going to be able to resist those sort of numbers in the future. So in summary, just the takeaways from this is that hidden behind the scenes, there's a disaster in place in traditional distribution networks. It's unseen, it's not talked about because it's common to everyone. But now that the digital guys are in the sandbox, things will change. They must change. Inventories will be consolidated, taken out of distributors and consolidated, brought under control, which is good for everyone in the existing networks. It works for the distributors. They love the idea. And these new warehouses, which we assume in many cases will be multi-user, multi-client, so multi-principals going into large consolidated warehouses, automation will play a bigger and bigger part of that. And as I said, it's not high-tech automation, it's not scary automation, but it's just the cost impact and the soft benefits impact is phenomenal. So that's our prediction for what's going to happen over the next 10, 15 years. And we see it across Southeast Asia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Fascinating and very relevant in Vietnam, without doubt. Please, if anyone's got questions, please put them in the Q&A function and we'll get back to you after the presentations. We'll now go to John Campbell. Thank you.
Thank you all for attending this morning, and thanks to Michael and John from Vina Capital and LCA for their fantastic presentations and insights. It's an honor for me to share Savills' latest industrial insights from our latest white paper with you all today, which will be released very soon. For my presentation, I'm going to focus on some key points and outtakes from the white paper, and then we'll have the Q&A session at the end, as Neil mentioned. Our team this year represents Vietnam's transformative story and its resilience in bouncing back after a very trying and difficult year. The last 20 years has seen Vietnam transition from an agricultural-based economy to one of the most popular industrial and logistic hubs in Asia. Once a location associated with low cost and high volume manufacturing, the transition now is moving towards labor-intensive industries, from labor-intensive industries towards higher value-added and skill-based industries. And with the recent US-China trade war, the EV FTA and the multinationals relocating out of China, the opportunity for the industrial sector in Vietnam is greater than ever before. Despite a challenging 2021, the transition is continuing. The country fights on as the pandemic has affected all of its sectors in Q2 and Q3 this year. Although production disruptions in factories and industrial parks attracted considerable media coverage, the Prime Minister has reaffirmed the government's commitment to protect the interests of the FDI investors. And with the restrictions being eased in October and the government's positive change from zero COVID strategy to living with COVID strategy, the outlook for Vietnam is far more positive now. So let's begin with the macro overview of the Asian region. So the Asian Development Bank predicts that Vietnam's GDP will end at 3.5% this year and will reach 6.5% in 2022, should 70% of the population receive their vaccinations. Manufacturing salaries rose from $252 in 2018 to $315 this year. So quite a big increase. However, as you can see from the chart on the bottom left, this still remained very competitive regionally, and it's significantly lower than China and Malaysia. In terms of supply, the country has 397 established industrial parks, which is quite significant for a country of its size and very competitive against its Southeast Asian counterparts. So moving to the next slide. In terms of industrial industrial construction costs, Vietnam is one of the most competitive. These figures are taken from Arcadis 2020 construction cost survey, and they measure both the cost per square meter for basic industrial shells and also for more tailored owner-occupier facilities. So for the basic shells is about $309 to $389 a square meter in Ho Chi Minh City, certainly more competitive in outside provinces. And for tailored owner-occupier facilities, it's around $389 to $460 a square meter. In terms of trade, the first 8 months of this year has seen export turnover reach $212 billion, which is actually up 21% year on year. Phones and their parts gained the most turnover with $35 billion, up 13% year on year. And in second place was electronic goods and computers, reaching $31 billion and up 15.8%. In terms of destination markets, export markets, the US was the largest with over $62 billion, followed by China with over $32 billion, accounting for 19%. On the right-hand side here, we have the US imports by source. This is data we also included last year, but this is taken from Jungle Scout's annual survey on US imports by source markets. You can see there that China has quite a significant portion of the pie there, like over 41%. And it looks like Vietnam has a very small share there at 6.5%. But the interesting point is Vietnam is actually second. So at 6.5%, Vietnam accounts for the second most amount of shipments to the US in the first half of this year. And that represents over 473,000 shipments. So still very improving, and it's actually increased 5.5% year on year from the first half of last year. So with shipments continuing to increase to the US, it shows even during the pandemic, Vietnam is performing quite well. Now, the EU-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement, I like this slide. So the last year and the years before we did webinars, we always talk about the EU-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement, but today we can actually share some backup data about what are the actual results so far. So the chart on the left, we have the EU imports right up until the first 9 months of this year, until Q3. And we can see that turnover has soared since the EV-FTA ratification last August. So in 9 months, there's been over 2,242 projects, which is actually up 164 projects year on year. So this represents over $22.2 billion, up around $500 million year on year. Some big names there, Shell Group, Daimler Chrysler, and Siemens are some of the big investors in the first 9 months of this year. So very promising. As you can see from the quote there from Gilberto Albertini, it's looking like this capital, technologies, and expertise transfer is going to be fantastic in the coming years due to the EU-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement. So promising times ahead. In terms of industrial property and industrial land supply, as I mentioned earlier, there's 394 established industrial parks. This is on around 122,000 hectares, of which 286 parks are operational, with occupancy reaching 71.8%. So this is down from 74% last year. So demand still continues to outpace supply, but we're seeing a bit of stabilization there. And furthermore, 108 industrial parks, which are currently undergoing clearance or compensation. FDI, manufacturing FDI. So the total foreign investments in the first 9 months of this year, over 52% were, or 53% were attributed to manufacturing. Total manufacturing FDI was $11.8 billion, which is increased 16% year on year. So despite the very difficult Q2 and Q3 this year, it's promising to see that manufacturing FDI is actually up over the same period last year. In terms of new projects, there's 402 projects with newly registered capital of $5.4 billion. We can see there in the chart in the bottom left, the North had a significant supply of all of the foreign projects this year. Over 72% of all manufacturing projects this year went into the north of Vietnam. And when you look at the provinces on the bottom right there, you can see why. I mean, Quang Ninh, Vinh Phuc, and Bac Ninh are the three highest receivers of FDI. So when you see Quang Ninh getting some traction recently, we've seen Hai Phong last year, now we see Quang Ninh this year. Bac Giang as well up there around the electronics cluster. A lot of these big Foxconn electronic investments, a lot of the Apple suppliers, they're going up around this cluster. Just to give you an idea, something tangible there, you see who are the actual investors. So I put a list of the 5 top investors for the North and South. So in the North, Kraft Vina from Japan invested over $610 million in Vinh Phuc. Jinko Solar from Hong Kong invested over $498 million in Quang Ninh, and Foxconn increasing their investment there in Bac Giang Industrial Park. In the South, the numbers are a bit smaller, but there's more diversified industries like ILD Coffee Holdings, a food and beverage company with $76 million investment in Bình Nhưỡng, and Ping Fu Home Products with their investment in Vinh Phuc province. So it's good to see that there's actually people still investing in Vietnam despite this year. There's still companies moving here. They're still leasing land. They're still building their factories and their warehouses for long term. Here's an important slide. Manufacturing PMI, the Purchasing Managers Index, and industrial production. So if I was to show you this slide last month and we looked at September, it wouldn't have painted a very promising picture. But thankfully in October, PMI has actually surpassed the 50-point threshold after September's 16-month low. So we're finally above 50 points here with 52.1. And this is the first growth since May as COVID infections have eased. And this also represents outputs, new orders, and purchasing activity increasing. So overall confidence is strengthened under the hope that the pandemic will now remain somewhat under control. Industrial production is still down minus 0.6% year on year in October. However, it's still promising against September because it was minus 7.5%. So it still is an increase on the previous month. And if we look at the first 10 months overall, industrial output actually increased 3.3% over the same period last year. So I think October is representing an important month and a turning point for the last quarter of the year and for 2022. Again, let's look at some the supply. So this is the North Economic Zone supply. This represents some of the key provinces, 6 of the key provinces. You can see that Bac Ninh and Hanoi are some of the areas that have limited vacant land and some higher lease prices. If we look at the figures behind, this, we can see that the average occupancy is reaching about 87%, which is only up 2.3% since last year. So that goes to show that overall, with the pandemic and with companies not being able to travel here, the occupancies have stabilized in some of the provinces. The land lease price is $100 a square meter this year, average. This is up from $91 last year, so represents almost 9.8 increase. So that's the industrial park supply and performance. Let's have a quick look at the ready-built factory and the warehouse supply. So around $4.6 is the average in the 6 provinces this year. We're representing about 12.2% growth year on year. Bac Ninh has the highest average rent at about $5.3 a square meter per month, followed by Hai Phong at 5.2. In terms of share, Bac Ninh also has the highest share of the north. So Bac Ninh has 10% of the total ready-built factory and warehouse share in all of Vietnam, so over 10%, while Bac Ninh has 7.6%. Let's move on to the south. So we see some of the key provinces in the south that have limited land supply and higher lease prices are in Ho Chi Minh City, Dong Nai, and Binh Duong. Again, if we break down the numbers from the chart, interestingly, occupancy is similar. It's 87% also, with the same year-on-year growth at over 2%. The land lease price, however, is more expensive in the north, averaging $115 a square meter for the entire term. This is up about 10% year on year. We look at the rental supply, just a bit higher than the north, averaging at $4.7 per square meter per month, growing at around $6.8. Ho Chi Minh has the highest average monthly rental at $5.4 per square meter, followed by Long An with over 5.1. In terms of supply, Dong Nai has a massive portion of all ready-built factory and supply in all of Vietnam with over 22%. And Binh Duong is close behind with over 20% of national supply as well. Okay, so let's have a look at the logistics and the e-commerce. The logistic landscape is changing, and I go into a lot more detail in this in the white paper, which you'll see soon. But regarding performance, some positive news is Vietnam's performance in the Agility Emerging Logistic Markets Index, which was released this year. Vietnam is in the top 10 in the index at 8th place. So this is moving up 3 places from last year. And among ASEAN countries, it's behind Indonesia and Malaysia, but still ahead of Thailand, Philippines, and Cambodia. Regarding e-commerce, in 2020, Vietnam's e-commerce revenues were about $11.8 billion and accounting for 5.5% of total retail sales and of goods and services. So this represents one of the fastest growing internet economies in Southeast Asia with a growth rate of around 36% last year. So this e-commerce boom is providing an opportunity for innovative and efficient logistic and last mile delivery services. And we're seeing a lot more companies open up in that space, trying to create innovative solutions. Okay, so let's move on to the future forecasts. This is what do we expect to see and what are the key trends happening in the market. So I'll start with 2 of the more talked about ones. The first is Industry 4.0 and smarter manufacturing. Industry 4.0 is capturing the attention of countries globally, and Vietnam is no exception. By moving up the value chain, opportunities arise to upgrade the capability of Vietnam's manufacturing and start using emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, 3D printing, and automation solutions. And according to the Central Institute of Economic Management, manufacturing could see a 16% growth in 4.0 strategies by 2030 if small and medium-sized enterprises start implementing medium-level technologies. And this could grow up to $7 to $14 billion by the end of 2030 as well. Some examples in the market, we have Vingroup already utilizing 1,200 ABB robots in their welding processes. Local developer KTG Industrial also developing their 4.0 ready-built factory units in Dong Nai province. So we're certainly seeing some positive movement in that space. Sustainable and eco-friendly IPs. Last year, the Ministry of Planning and Investment and UNIDO launched a plan to create more eco-friendly IPs to increase clean and low carbon technologies and minimize greenhouse gas emissions and water pollutants and improve water efficiency. So the project has seen 5 pilot industrial parks being chosen, and they're going to evaluate in 3 more years. In 2023, they're going to evaluate the performance, and if successful, they're going to make it into a national model. Deep Sea in Haiphong is one of the 5 pilot projects and is the only European managed industrial park in Vietnam, which is well known for its quality services, utilities and infrastructure. Restructuring of IP models. Even the National Budget Committee and in the National Assembly, the Finance and Budget Committee announced that Vietnam's IP model is outdated and industrial parks of a few hundred hectares are no longer suitable for attracting waves of investment in the future. So there needs to be some restructuring of those models. And one potential solution is clustering, which could help the sector move up the value chain and benefit from sector-specific industries, but by clustering certain industries together, like automotive or electronics. Consolidating these projects by industry could create production networks that could help the country. Regarding industrial park master plans, there has also been some issue in the last 10 to 15 years of old industrial parks partitioning too much of their land for manufacturing and not enough commercial or service land for new projects like data centers or research and development centers. So I think a lot of the new industrial zones that are being built in the coming years will have more sophisticated and mixed use master plans. Sale leasebacks, something we've released a lot of content on this year. You might have read some of our articles, but last year with the pandemic, we've seen more companies, more manufacturers and logistic companies realize that they can utilize their facilities, they can take them off the balance sheet and sell their assets and lease them back to raise capital. So the emergence of the sale leaseback strategy is becoming a smarter and more viable options for companies who are trying to improve their cash flow or invest in other arms of their business. It's very simple and it's very cost effective as an alternative to taking out high interest loans from the banks. Here's an example on the slide, just how it works. So the seller sells their factory or warehouse to the investor. The investor then becomes the landlord. The seller signs a lease contract with the landlord and then becomes the tenant. So quite a simple process, but very effective for making a profit on the asset that you bought it on years ago, and also not having the high interest attached to it. One more point on sale and leasebacks is, although they're increasing in popularity in the last year or two, they're still underutilized in Vietnam. And I think there's still a lot of owner occupiers who are not aware of the solution as a potential means of financing. But we have seen some companies pave the way in recent years. The first high profile case was DKSH selling their warehouse and leasing it back in 2017. In 2018, we've seen Unilever from the US sell their Bình Young warehouse to Mapletree Logistics Trust and lease it back. And some local logistic players in Vietnam as well have also sold and leased back their facilities. So we think in 2022 and 23 going forward, we're going to see more of these transactions in the market. Data centers, another topic that's talked about a lot in the media, also by Savills. I mean, data centers, as COVID moves the world online, there's more and more opportunities for data center investors, not just in Vietnam, but globally. The rapid increase in e-commerce stressed how vital data centers are. And Vietnam actually leads the way amongst Southeast Asian countries in this market. In 2019, Vietnam data center market was valued at about $730 million, and it's expected to be valued at $1.6 billion in 2025. So that represents a compound growth of around 14%, which is quite significant. And it's mainly driven by obviously the big data solutions, Internet of Things and cloud-based solutions. The important components for data centers, obviously they're expensive facilities, power quality and supply, cooling, internet, security, and redundancy are very important factors to be considered when building these assets. From a real estate perspective, they can be very lucrative for investors, seeing as tenants usually lease long-term from 10 to 30 years. So it does provide a long-term income stream. However, there are some considerations that need to be taken into account. The first is high infrastructure costs means they're expensive to build data centers. For non-specialists, they're very complex to manage, and the danger of them becoming obsolete. So that could mean there's expensive maintenance and upgrading costs involved as well. So in Vietnam, what we're experiencing as an agency, when we have clients asking for Savills to help find some properties for sale and leaseback. A lot of the investors, they're interested in going to industrial zones or high-tech zones because the power supply and the infrastructure capability is better there than most projects. And obviously the distance to the main cities is very important and skilled labor, but there is a bit of a limitation on the supply for these guys, because in some of the industrial and high-tech zones near the cities, a lot of the local data center players like VNPT, Viettel, FPT, they're already present in those zones, and those zones also have high occupancy. So one potential strategy for foreign investors is looking for strategic partners, local partners in Vietnam if they want to enter this market. The final trend, cold storage. So Asia's growing middle class and economies means that the demand for safe food products is higher than ever. So the Vietnam's cold logistics is growing as groceries and modern retail grow, and as e-commerce grows. It's expected to be worth $295 million by 2025, with a 12% growth per annum. The cold logistics sector in Vietnam is divided into cold storage with approximately 600,000 pallets, and also cold transportation, which has about 700 plus refrigerated trucks and terminal tracks. Seafood processing sector is dominating the self-operating market, and despite growing demand, it's still in short supply. The amount of cold storage facilities in the north and in the south is still in short supply. And we experience having many companies or tenants looking for space, but they cannot find it in the cities. So only 48 facilities in 2019 with approximately 600,000 pallets. So that's still not quite enough to serve the market demand. And we're seeing it's turning into be a bit of an issue for tenants who can't expand their businesses. Between the north and south, the cold logistics market in the south is more developed. In terms of foreign versus local players, the local guys have the land supply and the locations, but the foreign players like Emergent Cold, they have better quality management and added value services. A few issues from the real estate perspective is long build times and high costs have resulted in rental supply, limited supply and rental increases. So the rent is much higher now per ton than it was 2-3 years ago. So another factor to be considered. So to summarize, the government's reopening plan has instilled confidence in developers and investors worldwide in Vietnam. The government's continued support for foreign investors has been very important, as well as local companies' adaptability and resilience in overcoming the past few quarters. A successful 2022 will rely on international flights resuming. It will heavily rely on, I would say, for a lot of developers looking to lease their projects. However, as I talked about with PMI and industrial production, Q4 is looking to be turning around quite positively as the restrictions are being eased already and businesses are up and running again. We don't believe that Vietnam will just recover, but we believe that it will bounce back stronger. What do we think will be the outlook from next year on? We think that the China Plus One model is going to be continued to be pursued by manufacturers again, as Michael also emphasized. We're going to see more new supply in key provinces, more sophisticated industrial park master plans for multi-use. And as I mentioned in the trends, smarter manufacturing, eco-friendly and sustainable projects, sale and leasebacks, data centers and cold storage will all continue to grow as well. So that's the end of my presentation, and I look forward to answering some of your questions during the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Fantastic insights. For those that would like to hear more from John, please register your interest in the white paper and we will make sure you receive a online copy, a digital copy. Okay, we will now move to the Q&A, and I'll start with a question to Michael Kokalari. The question that's come in, Mike, is will the pandemic leave permanent damage and reduce the growth prospects of emerging economies like Vietnam? And related to that, how can Vietnam turn the crisis into a positive and use it to accelerate structural changes? Would you like to comment on that? Thank you.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So you do hear there's a fancy economics term you hear more and more now, which is hysteresis, or how you pronounce it, something like that, and that is the idea of permanent scarring in emerging markets. That you hear more discussion about this, and as I kind of alluded to in my presentation, I think in Vietnam's case, it's actually going to be the opposite. Because if you look at what are the structural barriers that are, or I shouldn't say, so what are some of the structural barriers that have been holding back Vietnam from reaching its full potential? So things like infrastructure development, things like more privatization, more, things of this nature. Actually, the only thing that's really been holding us back is complacency. I mean, the idea of developing your infrastructure, many countries around the world have developed their infrastructure. This is a very well understood, how to do this. And certainly it's not a money issue. They have had enough money in Vietnam for many years to do this. So what my primary thesis is, which is I tried to reflect in the last slide of my presentation there, is that the economic crisis in Vietnam this year, which is the most severe crisis since the 1980s. And what happened in Vietnam after this very difficult crisis in the 1980s? Well, that's when you got all these, the so-called Doi Moi reforms. So what my belief is that, number one, what was holding us back was complacency. These problems are not that complicated to solve. Vietnam has got all the World Bank and everyone coming to them. The government's telling, oh, you're great, everything's great here, so that fosters some complacency. And that because the crisis has been so severe, we're going to have a kind of Doi Moi 2.0. It's going to shake up that complacency, and I think you'll see a lot of improvements, structural improvements, both in the government and also in the companies. If we imagine companies, adopting international best practices, things of this nature, I think we're going to be on a permanently higher growth trajectory, which is not the case in a lot of in a lot of EM. So.
A somewhat related question, Michael, just come in. Can you elaborate on the secular stagnation in Japan and Korea?
Yeah. Okay. So there are two issues here, which is the demographics and also the amount of debt that a society has accumulated. Can we put that chart back on the? Is that possible to put my demographics chart back on the? While they're working on that, let me give the precursor, which is that demographics is by far the most important growth driver, long-term secular growth driver. The World Bank put out a report, go back a bit, one more. Yeah, this one, no, forward, yeah. All right, so the World Bank put out a report, I think about a month ago or so, and they said that since 1990, about 1/3 of Vietnam's growth has been driven by demographics. So of course, all the Doi Moi reform I just mentioned and FTAs, all that stuff is also very important. But you think about that, just 1/3 of the growth was baked in from demographics. Now in Korea and Japan, the story is flipped. Is the reverse of Vietnam. So in Vietnam, we have a very positive demographic story going forward, and here we have a very negative story. And let me explain to you what we're seeing on the screen here. These two charts that look a little bit complicated, both of these charts are the number of people in absolute terms, so millions of people. Both of these charts are the millions of people in, on the left is Japan and on the right is Korea, the number of millions of people that are in the age bracket of 45 to 50. Why the age bracket of 45 to 50? Because this is when people spend the most in their life. This is when people are the most productive in their life. And so what happens and this is a very, very consistent indicator across many society, depending on the culture, it doesn't matter. It's like Russia or China or the US. When the number of people in a society's peak spending cohort is going up, that economy is on a secular up trend. And when it rolls over and starts going down, you have less workers, you have less income. And so now your economy is on a secular down trend. And you can see that in Japan, The peak was in 1990. This is exactly when the bubble peaked in Japan, and in Korea was around 2016, 17. Okay, so the number of people is less, and at the same time, both societies accumulated a lot of debt. Debt makes your society less productive, and so those two things coming together are why Japan and Korea have terrible investment prospects in both countries, and that they need to invest outside their countries. And by the way, China is also kind of getting into this story as well, which is why you start to see the Evergrande and all that type of story happening. So does that answer the question?
Very well, Mike. Thank you very much. And maybe leading from that, so the fantastic growth in the middle class and the growth we're seeing in e-commerce, a question to John Tolbert. We've got a question here about the scale of the need for distribution centers around Ho Chi Minh and Hanoi, and typically what size would those warehouses be?
Okay, well, I certainly can't claim to be an expert on Vietnam, so I'm a little bit, it's a bit of a general
around the region, perhaps.
Yeah, yeah, you would have to say that, I mean, Michael was mentioning demographics baking in growth naturally, but given that we're, I think, talking about there being a sea change in the type of warehousing that's going to be required, I think there has to be phenomenal growth potential for both Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh. It's because essentially, if you're let's say a Unilever and a Procter and Gamble, you know, competing head to head, one of them moves to this type of warehouse, the other has to follow. You know, you cannot be running your logistics with you cannot be running a warehouse at 30% extra cost to your main competitors. Not to mention the qualitative benefits, et cetera, you know, and you know, as the land cost goes up, labor cost goes up, you're going to be more and more exposed. So yes, it would seem absolutely natural that close to the two big population centers, I think there'll be potential for huge growth, but essentially, I mean, a big part of it driven by the fact that existing warehouses are not going to do the job any longer. I mean, and it's quite an interesting question because I know there are people developing relatively conventional warehouses at the moment in Vietnam, but we know there are also people looking at sort of multi-user automated or semi-automated warehouses as well. And for my money, I think it's the latter is going to win out, and that will sort of antiquate existing warehouses and force people into the new type. So yes, huge opportunity.
And the typical size, maybe a range of those warehouses elsewhere in the region?
Yeah, it's when you talk to like FMCG manufacturers, there's a big trend at the moment. They like the idea of being in a multi-user facility, because it offers more flexibility. Obviously, you know, if you can relatively rubber walls, you can put in 25,000 pallets this year, but going to 30,000 pallets in 2 years, 35,000 pallets 2 years later. The people we speak to in manufacturing really like that. They also like the potential in multi-user facilities or clustered facilities of combining transport. You know, so if you're doing long-haul transport or overnight transport out to different sections of the north or the south, why not combine it with even with your competitors to get it into the region? You know, you're all going to be getting product into a particular province. There's no real challenge in putting it into the same truck to get it there. So that's another major change we're seeing with manufacturers. They used to be very, very protective. You know, I won a contract with Unilever when I first came to Malaysia. Colgate wanted to come into the same building, and Unilever just said, "Don't even think about it. You know, it's not going to happen." 15 years on, that mindset seems to have gone. So long as their product's protected, they're not going to have people browsing through their product and seeing what promotions they're doing, etc. So yeah, I would be saying the size of these warehouses. Now, I'm not very good speaking about, I noticed since we've been with Savills that everyone speaks in square feet and square meters. I tend to think in pallets, but we'd be thinking of, optimal economic size could be about 150,000 pallets, even up to 200,000 pallets in one location, to get the benefits of a group of manufacturers, each with, in a country like Vietnam, a lot of manufacturers may have about 20,000 pallets. A mid-range, a large manufacturer may have about 20,000, 25,000 pallets storage. So yeah, we'd see maybe trying to get six or seven of them together would make sense. So 150,000 to 200,000 pallets.
Okay, great, thank you. And what do you see as the timing for building ASRS in Vietnam? Maybe just explain ASRS again to the audience quickly.
Okay, yeah, I saw that question come through. It's a good question. The ASRS, so when we're talking about automation, I mean, and it's going to be horses for courses, but generally we see the big opportunity as being basic automation, which is, or very conventional automation, which is ASRS, which is automatic storage and retrieval systems, which is basically very high bay racking, going about 40 meters, up to 40 meters high, serviced by cranes. So automated cranes. So what that gives you is massive density, but it also, if you've got enough movement and enough storage, it gives you relatively low cost per pallet. So that's the key of it. And then the other aspect of it is the pallets that need to move in and out of that store basically move around on AGVs, automated guided vehicles, which are just little little robots that basically, not that small, but just can carry a pallet from one part of the warehouse to another. Again, both these technologies have been around for 30 plus years, so there's nothing new in them. And interestingly, the physics of them haven't changed much either. There's a reason that ASRS go about 40 meters high. After that, basically steel costs, infrastructure, the floor costs just get too high. So it doesn't make sense for people to go beyond that. So it's not like there's radical change in the equipment these days. I know e-commerce companies have brought in AMRs, sort of smarter robots, etc. That will still apply, but the fundamentals of the shape and the size aren't going to change. I'd say that, yeah, large warehouses. When are they coming into Vietnam? They're coming into Malaysia right now. I mean, we've got IKEA have built the biggest warehouse in Malaysia. I believe they've gone live with it, and huge ASRS system. I know property developers, I won't mention them by name, but I saw one of their representatives is on the call, also coming in to do this sort of automation. Instinctively, I mean, markets like Malaysia, Thailand are going to be ahead because of the labor costs. But you would anticipate, I mean, and again, I'm not an expert on Vietnam at all, but you wouldn't, given if we can get a 35% cost saving in Malaysia, I can't see that you wouldn't at least get half that amount in Vietnam. So still an attractive proposition. And knowing who's in Vietnam at the moment in terms of development, I'm assuming this is coming in the next few years, but I have no inside information.
Excellent, thank you, John. We'll move to a very Vietnam specific question to John Campbell. And that is that in the first 9 months of this year, northern provinces like Quang Binh and Bac Giang have received significant manufacturing investments. Can you explain just why that is, John? Why those provinces, why have they stood out in the first 9 months of this year?
Yeah, good question. I mean, yeah, the North in general, as I mentioned, I think got over 72% of all manufacturing this year. So yeah, very significant. And we've seen a similar story last year as well with some different provinces from the North. But Quang Ninh, I'll start with Quang Ninh. Quang Ninh has been getting a lot more momentum the past couple of years. You know, Hanoi, unlike Ho Chi Minh, doesn't have a port in the city like Ho Chi Minh does. So the closest port people go to is the Hai Phong. Now, Haiphong still has some land left, higher price, but some manufacturers from Taiwan, from China, they're interested in Guangmin. The price is more competitive than Haiphong. They have access to the port and they have proximity to China as well. So you can see from the FDI manufacturing list I went through as well, some of the big names there from China and Taiwan, like Foxconn and these guys coming in and building their facilities in Guangmin. Regarding Baksang, this is also quite important for the electronics cluster in the north. Bac Ninh is always the preference, where Samsung had its first $17 billion facility. All of the industrial zones in Quang Ninh are now occupied. Obviously, Hanoi is very difficult to get any industrial land. So we're seeing more and more manufacturers and even logistic players and distribution centers go to Hung Yen and Bac Giang as these kind of tier 2 options as Bac Ninh is occupied. So Bac Giang has been getting a lot more interest from these guys as well. And we expect that, you know, more of the new industrial zones coming live in Bac Ninh next year will be reaching occupancy soon.
Yeah, I think it's what I mentioned about the electronics. This is the whole, you know, FDI committed FDI for is up about almost 20% this year, and it's all electronics. You use the very important word cluster, which is invented by my teacher, Michael Porter at the Harvard Business School. And this is where all the electronics activity is. So, yeah.
Yeah, and we're going to continue to see that as well. So, I mean, as Michael mentioned in his presentation, a lot of the multinationals moving from China to Vietnam, it's not so much low value added industry, it's more electronics and high value added products. And the North is traditionally where these projects would go. And these are the bigger projects too. I mean, the South, we have smaller diversified projects, food and beverage, textiles, every different industry you can find. But in the North, you'll see the bigger substantial projects, and especially for electronics and automotive.
Thank you, John. Question just come in from the Vinhomes Industrial Park team, asking about smart manufacturing and eco-industrial parks. So you talked about integrated industrial parks and the changes that are taking place there. Could you expand on that a bit and see how you see the planning around industrial parks changing in the next few years?
Yeah, I mean, the industrial parks have to change with the investment wave of the manufacturers, right? As I mentioned, for example, with new tenants coming to Vietnam, like data center investors, high value added manufacturing investors, high tech, these guys have different capabilities when it comes to power supply, when it comes to infrastructure and utilities, and when it comes to sustainability as well. I mean, a lot of these guys, they have some big brand names in the world, you know, they want to be working with sustainable partners. So having sustainable initiatives in your industrial zone only makes sense in the future. And that's why we're seeing more innovative developers like DeepSea going ahead and doing this as well. And other developers are following it. The extent of what you're incorporating varies. I mean, you can be doing something as small as having a solar panel partner and putting the panels on top of the factories and the warehouses in your industrial zone, or you could go further than that and have much more sustainable initiatives around the project. It depends on the developer, but I mean, as we see more high value projects come to Vietnam, we're going to see a lot more developers be creative with their industrial zones. It's just about smarter manufacturing as well. This is something that's happened already, and you mentioned the question from Vinhomes. I mean, Vin Group themselves under the same company is a good example of that. As I mentioned, they're already incorporating ABB robots in their welding processes. Lenovo and Schneider in China are implementing smart technology as well. They also have facilities in Vietnam, which they plan on bringing here as well. And as I mentioned with KTG as well, leading the way for the 4.0 factories.
Thanks, John. Maybe John Talbot, just expand on that a bit in terms of smart manufacturing technologies that are coming to the fore.
I'm afraid that I would be out of my depth. I'm really on the logistics side, so I'd be out of my depth if I started trying to speak about manufacturing. Okay,
we'll move on. Michael, a question for you. You've already touched on it, but please share a few leading indicators on how acute the economic contraction is in Vietnam, and how is Vietnam's manufacturing sitting relative to the rest of the world?
Okay, so if you look at the sort of, what I was looking at this year was the month-on-month changes in the manufacturing activity and also the retail consumption when, because everything got shut down. And probably to give you a feeling of how acute things were, how bad things were, is when we reopened, the retail sales shot up almost 20% in 1 month. So that's kind of retrospectively gives you a feeling about how bad it was. Actually, for manufacturing, the hit was not as bad, partially because of the activity in the north. There was a period of time there where sort of industrial production in the north was growing at about a 20% year-on-year rate, about 10% rate, while in the south it was like falling at a 20% rate. So we net ended up being, I think we're probably going to, manufacturing is probably going to grow around 8.5% this year, and it's still bolstered by these the demand for the so-called stay-at-home goods, laptop computers, furniture, gym equipment, this kind of stuff. That having been said, next year is probably not going to be a great year for manufacturing in Vietnam, because the demand for all these kind of products, particularly by US consumers, which is our biggest market, they're saturated. They've bought all the stuff that they can. For those of you that follow the stock market, last Friday, Peloton, that makes those kind of fancy bikes, their share price sold off like 35% because the demand, people just bought all the stuff that they need. So unfortunately, I think manufacturing is probably not going to be that strong next year, but we'll have the reopening from the tourism and all that kind of stuff. I'm sorry, did I answer the question? Was there one other part that I missed there?
No, I think you've covered it. Leading indicators was it? Yeah. So I think you've covered it. Thank you, Mike. I think we'll wrap up with one last question for John Campbell. For everybody else, please post any questions you'd like us to get back to you on, and we'll follow up with email responses to those questions. So we will try to get back to everybody. John, just to wrap up, in terms of industries, what type of new inquiries are we seeing in Vietnam's industrial sector? You've touched on some of the trends and the transformation that is taking place, but maybe just wrap up in terms of where you see the new inquiry coming from.
I'll start with some of the inquiries we had about 4 to 5 years ago. It was probably about 70% bread and butter manufacturing, whether it was food and beverage manufacturing or textile factory. Whereas now, when you're looking at our inquiries this year and last year, I mean, we're seeing much more logistic inquiries as opposed to just manufacturing. Specialist industrial logistic facilities, like for cold storage, as I mentioned, research and development, people looking for space in the high-tech zones, and as I mentioned, data centers as well. So we have much more varied industries in our inquiry list, much more diversified than what it was before. So obviously that's a very exciting prospect as well, that we're going to see more of these transactions be closed next year.
Right. Thank you very much to all of our speakers, Michael Kokalari, John Talbot, and John Campbell. Appreciate your time. To all the audience, as well as the speakers, apologies for the technical issues at the beginning of the webinar and the resultant delays. We have run much longer than intended as a result. But as I said, please leave your questions in the chat box and we will get back to you by email. The white paper will be coming out very soon, and we look forward to meeting those that we can in person and following up with your inquiries. Thank you very much. Take care, stay safe, and we'll see you all again soon. Thank you. Thank you.